recognize that that term, rule-based order, obviously always was a very powerful narrative terminology. I mean, there was a ruled order, but to a certain degree, it followed, of course, of the ideals that we in the West preferred. It was based on American predominant strength. I mean, we were able to pursue these type of rule-based order because they were favorable to the United States ultimately, and the United States always understood that. There's an argument to be made that, well, authoritative states don't think that way. And so authoritative states were always trying to undermine that particular vision of rule based order. And I think that that's really what Carney is talking about.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Ian Campbell, digital editor here at MLI. In the wake of the United States and Israel's military strikes on Iran, other nations around the world rushed to stake out their positions. While some global voices condemned the attacks as a violation of international law, Canada issued a statement that drew a measure of surprise across the political spectrum, overhead of it being more supportive of the military actions than many expected. A statement released by the Prime Minister's office on February 28, in the hours following the initial attacks, declared that the Islamic Republic of Iran is the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East and has one of the world's worst human rights records and must never be allowed to obtain or develop nuclear weapons. It went on to say that Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. However, in Prime Minister Mark Carney's more recent comments on March 3rd, he added that Canada takes this position with, quote, regret, on the grounds that the conflict is another example of the failure of the international order. So, how should Canadians interpret the words of their Prime Minister, and how might these statements land south of the border? Is Carney's support a reversal of his much talked about Davos speech, or in fact, a logical extension of it? And how long is this supportive posture likely to last in the face of domestic pressures or further global events? And are we in fact already starting to see that shift from the government in their subsequent remarks? To unpack this, I'm joined by Rob Huebert, a political scientist and director of the University of Calgary's Centre for Military, Security, and Strategic Studies. He's also a senior fellow at MLI. Before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these conversations. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's indeed my pleasure.
So I'm curious to begin. When you saw Mark Carney's initial statement immediately following the first round of attacks on Iran, what was your reaction?
I was surprised. This is one of the most straightforward commentaries of support that we've seen any Canadian Prime Minister provide in a very long time. Usually, when it comes to commenting on a event such as the ongoing war that is now developing between the Americans, Israelis, and Iran. Usually it's situated in regret that the event is in fact happening. Canada hopes that the participants will be able to resolve it peacefully and stands by to give whatever assistance necessary. That's the tradition of what we've come to expect from these statements. It doesn't always reflect what a government will do, but it does reflect what the public statement is. To have a prime minister come so straightforward and say, yes, Iran is a threat and the Americans need to deal with it, that's a sort of a frank, a government being frank in a degree that we're just not used to. So it was surprised and to a certain degree impressed that, in fact, that Carney would seemingly be, as you said in the introduction, actually following up on precisely what he said in the Davos speech.
And you mentioned that this is different from what we've come to expect in Canada. Let's dive into that a bit more. Tell me, how would you see this in contrast to what perhaps we came to expect under the previous Canadian government led by Justin Trudeau? Is this a significant break from that?
Yeah, it's a very significant break. I mean, again, I'm hard pressed to think of any such supportive commentary that former Prime Minister Trudeau provided, particularly when it came to the American use of force. Usually, it was, remember, one of Trudeau's famous statements where we are post-national state with the assumption that the use of force was something that was behind us, and so it didn't even fit within the overall philosophy in terms of how we understand the international system. Again, it would be full of concern about the loss of life that's occurring, but no recognition that, in fact, that there are enemies and that states have to take actions in regards. And again, regardless of where you sit on the position, just the starkness of that recognition that Iran is a threat and has to be dealt with. That is just something that you just don't see in any of the preceding Trudeau statements.
I'm curious also, how would you compare Canada's initial response to the response we saw out of the gate from some of Canada's peer countries? I'm thinking, for example, here of the United Kingdom, which in their Feb 28 statement, they called the Iranian regime a direct threat and said it, quote, must never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon, though their statement also emphasized that the UK had played no role in the strikes. How does Canada's response stack up with some of its peers?
Well, again, I mean, it's hard. Usually, Canada sort of stands out, and you have to remember that many of the major European nations have, in fact, attempted to play various types of roles addressing the issue of the Iranian nuclear program, and so that they've been party to some of the discussions, so much more involved. And so, it's not surprising to see Britain or France taking this type of position, and also at the back of your mind, you always have to remember they're also thinking, okay, how do we stay consistent in also providing support to the Ukraine, and how do we make sure the Americans see that consistency? But the interesting thing when we think about Canada is just that you're not going to separate. In other words, you look at the actual comments, take away the naming, whether or not it's the Prime Minister of Britain or the Prime Minister of Canada, and those statements are pretty similar in terms of the identification of the threat and the acceptance of what the Americans are doing with the use of military force.
So tell me then, what's the impact of Canada having come out in this regard, and particularly when we're thinking south of the border, which is always uh, an issue that is close to Canada's foreign policy concerns.
We just have to look in terms of what's happening right now in terms of American-Spanish relations, because recognize that the Spanish have taken a very different position. They're not allowing the Americans to utilize their bases. And look at what Trump has done. He's basically said, "Okay, I'm going to cut off all trade with Spain just as a direct result. You are working against me on this issue." And so I think the fact that we've seen no sort of American response to what we've said is actually a positive one given the current status between Canada and American relations. In other words, when you have a leader such as Trump, you want to be staying out of the limelight, so to speak, in that context. And so the impact is that is not drawing the anger of Trump onto us. Now you can turn around and say, well, that's not a very worthy foreign policy initiative. But again, if we're putting it in the context of the type of realism that Carney is talking about at the Davos speech, it's fitting very easily there. That of course you're going to want to be making sure that you're not ticking off the great power that you have to deal with.
Yeah, let's delve further into that speech then, since you mentioned it. Of course, Mark Carney, just over a month ago, gave a much talked about speech at Davos on the shifting global order. Now, this is a point that's drawn a fair bit of debate online since Canada issued its statement a few days ago. Should Carney's initial position on this military action, should it be seen as an extension of the Davos speech, as some say, or others see it as a partial or even full retreat from it? Where do you come down on that, and why?
Well, this is where, as a sort of strategic studies nerd, I come down, and that is from my reading of Thucydides, where he's drawing the reference to the great powers doing what they can and the lesser powers doing what they must. I mean, my interpretation of that, and I can stand to people perhaps taking a different interpretation, is that that's in reference to the Milo dialogue. And the Milo's dialogue, of course, was about a city state that had been a former colony of Sparta, but finds itself right in front of the Athenian army as it's marching forward. And the Athenians say to the Millennians, basically, you switch sides and come onto our side, or we will destroy your city state, sell all your women and children into slavery, and kill all your men. And the smaller state turns around and says, yes, but we have our honor because we are connected. We are a former Spartan colony. We can't, we have to think about what people would think about us if we were so craven as to simply give in to your power. And the Athenians said, okay, well, too bad. And they go in, they conquer the city state very easily. They follow their word. They murder, they kill all the men, sell all the women off into slavery. And what many interpret that as saying is that in real politics and in the international system, you can pretend to have honor, you can pretend to have morality. This is where the whole realism debate really starts from. You can have all of that, but you have to ask the question in the international security regime, when you're dealing with a great power that's going to do whatever it feels is necessary for its own security, what does morality, what does honor mean? And so the smaller state has to basically do whatever's necessary that the greater state wants it to do in this context. And so if you take that interpretation of what Carney was saying, as opposed to some of the interpretations that are Carney's trying to look for sort of alternative power sources, which I don't think is what the point of his speech was. But again, that's my interpretation. But if you take the fact that he's drawing home the millennium dialogue of basically, if you're going to try as a small state, keep your honor, bad things are going to happen to you, even if the leaders have to say, okay, I'm being dishonorable, but your men, women, and children are still alive. And so my interpretation by Carney basically saying, yeah, U.S., we agree with you. I think that that's fitting within what he was saying there. Not that he was saying we need to have alternative sources of power to the United States, as I know some people are interpreting.
Now, given that there are these sort of multiple takes out there about Carney's speech, I think, does that open it up perhaps to one of the criticisms of it? Did he almost end up presenting something that was a bit of a Rorschach test where a broad spectrum of viewers could look at it and walk away with different conclusions? Is that perhaps a problem with the speech he gave in Davos?
That is exactly what Canadian political leaders have become very, very good at. I mean, we think one of the big traditions we have in Canada, our political leaders are always talking in somewhat vague terms about the Canadian forces as ultimately being peacekeepers all the time, when in fact that we know that they're not peacekeepers. They do peacekeeping because they're warriors. And that's what's allowed them to be in Suez, Cyprus, Yugoslavia. And so, again, the fact that he's trying to be something to many audiences, that's the nature of the beast. It's the directness, though, in terms, I think, of how he is referring to power and how instead of, a norm of Canadian prime ministers, and the last prime minister in particular, was to talk more of values rather than of hard interests. And I think that what Carney is doing, and again, it's really the debate is over how do you understand those interests? Are those interests with trying to make relationships with countries like China, India, as we've seen with with his various travels, or is making that interest, making sure that the Americans do not see us as getting in their way as the Athenians saw the millennials in that particular context. And I think that he's trying to say a little bit to everybody in that context. But I think the statement that he made regarding the Israeli-American-Iran war probably is pointing to the fact that he's recognizing the fact that we've got a U.S. that is only thinking in power politics context right now, however stable, unstable you want to say, that the shining house on the hill, the idea that there was a morality behind American foreign policy, that, of course, is over. And so, therefore, Canada has to align itself in that particular context. And so I think that the fact that the speech probably gives a little bit of space for saying, well, maybe we're looking for alternative partners, but he gave nothing else in that speech of saying we're turning our backs on the Americans. We have to be aware of a U.S. that in terms of any sort of I don't know, soft power, human security, sort of even understanding that we could have said under Biden or Obama or even the Bushes that we're talking about liberal exceptionalism all the time. That of course is gone, and so therefore Canada has to line it up that way.
Now, of course, to hold our governments to account, though, when they do try to be all things to all people, we have to try to drill down on that and parse that out. And of course, in the days following the attack as well, where we've seen subsequent statements from the government that are perhaps walking back by a measure some of that initial strong support they expressed. So we've seen Carney's made subsequent remarks that Canada will not be involved in sending troops, that Canada's support is offered, quote, with regret. Foreign Minister Anita Anand is out talking about Canada preferring diplomatic solutions and also declining to comment on the legality of the attacks. Do you clock a shift here from the government in the days following the initial events? And if so, how big a shift do you clock so far?
You're always going to see governments shifting back and forth. They're going to be reading the polls. They've got some of their own MPs, in fact, have offered opposition to what's being brought forward as well. So you're always going to get that shifting back and forth. So I'm not terribly surprised that we're seeing. And you have to ask the question, well, how meaningful is that? I mean, even the context in terms of when Carney says he regrets, recognize what he said he regrets. He regrets that we are in an international system where this is necessary to do, as opposed to we regret that the Americans did this. So, I mean, when he gives the regret statements, he's not really changing anything in terms of his support of the Americans. Just saying, boy, I wish we didn't have to be in this type of international environment, but we obviously do, and I regret that. But people can then read it saying, "Oh, so he regrets his statement," and I don't really think that's what he's doing. I think his other ministers are probably offering a little bit more of the traditional liberal sort of like, we're not going to be there. Now, again, in terms of the participation, we're not being asked to participate, and I don't know what we could do in capacity that wouldn't necessarily really strip down the forces that, of course, has been run down so badly during the last 10 years. And so, well, what could we really do in this aspect? I mean, remember, the whole thing that we're trying to do right now, the whole participation with the Golden Dome, the NORAD modernization, all the things that we were said we're now trying to do since at least February 2022, and some might say even later than that, is to get this type of technology, this ability of how the war is actually being conducted. And that's, basically it's a missile war right now. And when I say missiles, I'm including also UAVs and drones in that context. It's an aerospace battle at this point in time, which is really depending on how your system of being able to respond on those capabilities. And so Canada, of course, is very interested. I have no doubt that our military would love to be seeing the inside of that, to know that as we move ahead with NORAD modernization and with the participation in the Golden Dome, what's working, what's not working, how do we see it in that context? So we are not directly participating, but man, oh man, I bet you it's being a learning experience on that context. The part of the puzzle that I'm watching for and waiting for, and of course we've just seen, a very bizarre announcement by the government where they're getting rid of the national security advisor to the prime minister. I haven't had a chance really to think that through, what that has meant. I know Wesley Wark has had some strong opinions on what that actually means in discussion with one of the former security advisor, Vincent Rigby, who says he doesn't think it's a good idea. But the reason why I come back to security is recognize too what has to be, at least I hope is happening behind the scenes that does tie it to us, is recognize that the Hogue report actually identified Iran as one of the countries that's contributing to political interference. I mean, I think that took a lot of people by surprise that the government was willing to actually recognize Iran, but second of all, that it basically provided even though some people have criticisms of the Hogue report, still very clear saying, of course we've got the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians. That wasn't too much of a surprise for people. But I really think that when they also said, well, Pakistan and Iran are the two other countries we have to be aware of. So if the government understands and is willing to publicly acknowledge that Iran, above and beyond the missile threat that is the major focus of the American and Israeli and Arab states' efforts right now, there's also the political interference, the hybrid warfare, the relationships that, of course, that Iran has with Hamas and other organizations that are very destabilizing. And so, in my mind, the question is, of course, well, what is the government now doing in working with these other states to combat what we've identified as political interference? Iran politically interferes. Well, then that probably means a lot more in terms of what the Hogue report was actually willing to do. So, what are the steps we're now doing? They have to be behind the scenes. They can't be up in public because the moment the public knows about it, the Iranians will know what's happening. So, what are we doing in that regards right now? So, are we actually now taking the opportunity to work closer with the Americans and saying, okay, we've got a political interference problem with Iran and Canada, so that probably points to a political interference issue in the United States. I can't see the Iranians targeting us and not the Americans. And so therefore, how do you coordinate that type of a response? And I suspect that what we will be seeing, and perhaps what historians will discover, is that the real effort is now on dealing with the Iranian agents and the Iranian ability to politically interfere, and one would assume has misinformation and all the other stuff that the Hogue report actually identifies.
Just building on that, when you talk about the kinds of threats that Iran can pose, I think perhaps it's worth highlighting for Canadians to think about. There's certainly a debate in the United States right now about whether this is in their national interest or not to engage with Iran in this way. For Canadians as well, what should they bear in mind about the types of threats that Iran does pose to Canada or to global security more broadly, and the extent to which Canada would actually be limited, given the current state of its military, to participate in any operations to assert its own interest in this case?
Well, I think one of the greatest problems that Canada faces, is, of course, is that Canadian society is divided. Again, we don't have a unified narrative of understanding the responses that we had in Canada against the Iranian regime. Remember when, in fact, reports were coming out about widespread killings within the protesters that were trying to induce change against the Iranian regime. Remember, there was widespread protest within Canada. I mean, there was large numbers. But again, were we giving the same type of coverage to that say that we were giving for some of the protests against, one would say, the trucker protest, or the Black White Lives Matters protest, or even the Palestinian Israeli protest? And so I think to a certain degree, the magnitude of the amounts of Canadians that were coming up protesting against the Iranian regime and in support of those that were losing their lives, I think that caught Canadian society in general by surprise. And so we have the situation that I don't think that there's a full appreciation of those Canadians who say, yes, the Iranian regime is a threat. It is something that needs to be changed. And that narrative, of course, is something that I think is still being developed within Canada. And then, of course, that we see within that narrative, it doesn't have what many Canadians think would be the sort of the automatic, there's a tendency to say, well, it's Arab, Persian, potato, same thing. Of course, there's major differences within that. But aren't these people that are calling for the fall of the regime? Where's their position on the Palestinian Israeli issue, as if there has to be a connection? And so I think within Canadian society writ large, we're still trying to come to terms with understanding what is the nature of threat that Iran poses to Canada. And so the first part of that narrative is, well, it poses a threat to those Iranians that still have family in the state of Iran and that are being subject to any form of oppression in that context. The second issue is, of course, is the Iranian determination to get nuclear weapons. That, of course, will be an issue. Of course, everybody will say, okay, but then you have to talk about the American nuclear weapons. You got to talk about Pakistan. You got to talk about Israel, and all of that is fair to say. But adding another set of nuclear weapons is an issue. And the third thing is we return to what the Hogue report tells us is, in fact, that Iran has targeted Canada. That within the Hogue report, we know publicly that the Iranians are trying to destabilize us. Again, is to the degree, it's difficult. When I've read through that report, I have difficulty really coming to terms with how far the Iranian interference is, except to say Hogue says it's there. And so we have this three-level game going on as we try to understand in Canada, what does the Iranian threat actually mean? Okay, so it means it's hurting Canadians that are Iranian connections. It's hurting Canadians because they're targeting us for political interference. See, they're hurting us because they are adding an element of destabilization within the Middle East context. And so each of those are not necessarily completely in sync with each other, but I think that this is something that is just developing as we think in terms of the circumstances and then situate how we understand Iranian threats to Canada and then say, well, then how does this fit into what the Israelis, Arab states, and the United States are now doing vis-a-vis the military intervention against Iran?
Carney himself has said that Canada was not consulted about the actions before they were taken, while other countries like Germany say they were notified in advance by Israel. What should we make of this? And can you talk also just a bit more about Canada's ability or lack of ability right now to assert its own interests in this area?
Without knowing the specifics, the general rule of thumb is the countries that are notified are the ones that are seen as being trusted on that specific issue and relative to the actions that are going to be taken. Now, once again, that's a blanket sort of overgeneralization. I can't say with any certainty that that's why, say, Israel, United States, or Saudi, or whomever is providing the notifications to other states, why Canada was not notified. But if that sort of general sets of observation follows, it's probably based on the fact that Canada probably is increasingly seen as an unstable partner. I mean, again, it just starts with our efforts to try to get on the Security Council when we had that wake up call that, oh, so people don't think that we are, how is it worded? The world needs more Canada. Well, that's not what the world seems to be thinking. The other part of it is, do we have anything to contribute? And again, the military is pretty down. And we've just gone through this period when our foreign and defense policy tended to be more sort of prescriptive. Remember, Strong, Secure, and Engage had its entire first three chapters were basically saying to the world, hey, our military is focused on people and a certain type of understanding, which is admirable. But if you're Israel or United States and you're just about to attack Iran, are you really going to be concerned with that? And so I think to a certain degree, Canada has created, and this is so hard to say as a Canadian, but because we've been proud of the influence we've had, but I think that we've created a certain irrelevancy with our combination of lecturing others and then basically not providing, in either foreign or defense policy, the means of support. I mean, when you're down to 1 to 1.4% of your GDP on defense, you cut your foreign affairs development agencies, and all you're doing is lecturing others on how they should be. Ain't going to build up that much support. Now, having said all that, I really do come back to the point. Countries will be notified that are relevant to the situation. Were we relevant to what was happening or about to happen? And I would say it's hard to find a reason that we would be.
I want to come back to something else you mentioned a few minutes ago, where you talked about in terms of when Mr. Carney says that he regrets having to support this, and you said, what kind of world is it that Carney regrets? Carney, he's talked, of course, about the rules-based order faltering, but as many have pointed out in recent weeks, one key condition that underwrote the rules-based order was American power. So when the United States exerts its power to take on a belligerent, oppressive regime in Iran, is it not a contradiction for Carney to say that the order is failing?
Yeah. Well, recognize that term, rule-based order, obviously always was a very powerful narrative terminology. It's not universal. I mean, there was a ruled order, But to a certain degree, it followed, of course, of the ideals that we in the West preferred. I mean, it was, of course, acceptance of gender equality, the right of human rights. In other words, there's a whole set of normative beliefs that follow that particular order, but it was based on American predominant strength. I mean, we were able to pursue these type of rule-based order because they were favorable to the United States ultimately, and the United States always understood that since the end of the Second World War. And so we can say, well, yeah, there is a rule-based order, but we in Canada have tended to say there's a normative value to that. In other words, everybody wants a piece of Canada. Everybody wants to be like Canada. The essence of what soft power is all about. There's an argument to be made that, well, authoritative states don't think that way. And so authoritative states were always trying to undermine that particular vision of rule-based order. And I think that that's really what Carney is talking about, is that there was a rule-based order, and there always will be a rule-based order. It's determined by whoever is the most powerful state. But we had come to accept that the normative underlinings, the embedded normative principles, human rights, equality, justice, all of that is what's starting to be problematic. So the Americans, under the Trump administration of the second term, is in fact trying to realign. They're trying to take out the normative underlining. We see their action towards gender equality. We see that they've declared war on DEI. We've seen the steps that Trump has said, but Trump has never said that the United States is stepping down as a power. His rhetoric is always, we're going to even make the U.S. more powerful. So there's always going to be a rule-based order. It's just a question of, well, what are some of the norms underneath it? So I think when Carney talks about the transformation or the breakdown, he's not talking about the overall rule system that is dictated by the most powerful state. He's talking about the values and norms that are within it. And that is what is being challenged directly, not so much from, the authoritative states have always wanted to get rid of it. I mean, go talk to the Iranian regime about how they feel about gender equality. And of course, you sit there and say, well, of course, there's no women that have been killed in these raids because women aren't allowed to enter into the senior political or military leadership of that. And that's a norm. That's a value. And so I think that really what Carney is saying is that the Americans are changing the value system on which the norms are in fact dedicated to, which means that we have to change from values and norms to, in fact, power and how we do that calculation. And I really think that what we see the Americans attempting to do in Venezuela, Cuba, Greenland, Canada, and now Iran is, of course, they're saying, well, yeah, we're going to enforce our rules and we're eliminating the norms that have overseeded them, that have been basically in our interest. But of course, Trump, we know quite clearly, doesn't have that understanding that how those interests have in fact made America the power state that it was.
Speaking of some of those other dimensions in the geopolitical situation right now that you mentioned, one of course is Cuba, where there is a United States military quarantine there right now. Can you talk a bit about your view on if there were to be further U.S. military action in Cuba? Can you talk about how we may see the possibility for a military to have success using a particular tactic or approach in one region and export it to somewhere else? Tell us about that, and then what is potential impact for Canada if we see the U.S. Take a further escalation with Cuba?
Yeah, well, there's two levels to your question, your very good question there. At the strategic level, if we see the Americans take efforts against Cuba, then again, it's always that uncomfortable discussion we have that, in fact, the Americans are doing what they said that they would do. And remember that their second last security document that just came out under Trump said that they're returning to the Monroe Doctrine, which is that the Americans have control of the Western Hemisphere. And so again, we have, we always forget this to our peril. Authoritative states or even authoritative leaning states like to tell people ahead of time what they're going to do. We always see this historically. They don't tend to hide it. And so for Trump to come forward and say, yes, I'm taking stronger control of the Western Hemisphere. And then we see what he did in Venezuela. And then we see what he's threatening to do in Cuba and what he's threatening to do with us in Greenland. You say, well, these are horrible ramifications and they are a real threat to Canadian security, but they're following what the Americans are saying. And again, we're seeing the rule-based order being rewritten, where the Americans are understanding, hey, it's just about power. Forget about human security or any of the niceties that we used to have on that. And I think that that's reflective. More to the point to Cuba, what we're seeing, and remember, the Americans will now think that the decapitation capabilities they have work. Now, you'll say, as a good social scientist, I'll say, well, there's only three case studies that you have. You do have to start with Obama's ordering of the decapitation of bin Laden. That was an assassination of a leader. And again, not of a state, but of a terrorist organization that, of course, was engaging in what we could, if we're not going to call it war, at least warlike behavior. And then we see, of course, the removal of not killing, but the capture for trial, the leader of Venezuela. And now we see the elimination of the leadership in Iran. So militaries, when they have that level of what will be seen as success, and it will be identified as success, and then we can get into the discussion, is it a long-term success or is it a more immediate or medium-term success? But nevertheless, this will be seen as a successful engagement. That would lead me to conclude that the American military probably would be planning to eliminate the leadership of the community of the Cuban regime. Now, does that mean capturing them to bring them for trial? And again, with Venezuela, we understand what the charges are. I think Cuba would be more difficult for the Americans to do that. Would the Americans be saying the bin Laden Iranian model is better? You go in and just simply assassinate. But I think that there's going to be a real thinking that you can do that without necessarily having the boots in the ground. Because, I mean, with what we're seeing in Venezuela, and again, you get into the argument, well, did Trump do that just simply to get the economic benefits of the oil? And again, we're seeing the way that he's controlling that without any pushback from Congress, where it seems as if he's almost adding it into his own private enterprise. And so, again, even if it's economics driven, there's a certain argument to be made. If you can go in and take out the leadership, but still maintain the economic levers, but get control of that, then it's going to favor the attacking state even more. So my suspicion is what you're going to be seeing if Cuba comes forward more so is, in fact, that this effort to get to the leadership and leave the rest of the state as unharmed as possible. The problem, of course, is that on a basis of a case selection of three, bin Laden, Iran, Venezuela, that never really proves anything. And what's going to happen the first time that strategy doesn't work? I mean, we may find out in Iran what happens when that strategy doesn't work. But that just makes me think that what we would see is the Americans would move in at a time that they think they can seize or capture most or all of the senior Cuban leadership. It would have been a lot easier for the Americans to do it when Castro was still alive and still represented sort of that very powerful figurehead. And given the fact that I doubt most Americans know who is the current leadership within Cuba, probably dilates that a little bit. But again, it's hard to know with any certainty.
And given Canada's historic stance to usually take a different tact from the Americans on Cuba, if we saw that, does that complicate things for the Carney government to maintain an overall supportive posture of the American administration right now?
Yeah, I think it makes it very complicated because we've always had a much warmer relationship. And remember, it is a lot of the Cuban tourist industry, even though Americans are restricted in terms, I don't think it's a total restriction. I can't quite remember what it is right at this moment, but, it's more Canadians that have been supporting the tourist business. So again, Canadians have a greater sort of connection with Cuba. And that goes back to the close connection, of course, that both Trudeau Sr. and Castro had. So we see this. We see the fact that, Justin Trudeau goes down to the funeral of Castro. Once again, that personal connection. And so it is there. But we come to the realization that Carney is trying to very clearly distance himself from the Trudeau government. You don't even have to look at the defense and security side to have a look at in terms of energy and all of that. In other words, I suspect historians will look back and see as much of the divide between Carney and Trudeau as you saw between Trudeau and Harper in terms of the policies. So Does that mean that in the event of the American effort to do something against Cuba, be it a decapitation strike or a larger scale strike, would Carney see that as an opportunity again to sort of move Canada away from what Trudeau was saying? But more importantly, would he then be offering this sort of post millennium? If we go back to Thucydides again, is he saying, "Hey, yeah, Canada's with you. We realize you're the bigger power, we're the lesser power, but you're going to do what you want to do, and we don't want to be, the current, it's Spain that's in the crossfire right now." And we know with Trump, whoever just doesn't, follow exactly what he says, just like the millennials when they don't follow what the Athenians say. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It doesn't matter if it's morally correct. All that matters is the big one wants it, and if you're not going to go along, you're going to get stomped on. And I think that wait to see, but my suspicions are we wouldn't make that much of a fuss of an effort to change the regime. Now, if the Americans choose instead to have a full-fledged invasion of Cuba, I think that might change how the Carney government would respond. But if it's a decapitation, and again, it's going back in terms of the Americans are obviously having, in their view, and I think in a lot of people's view, success with that strategy, would that be the continuation? And at that point, I think Carney probably would just say, okay, yeah, we understand what is necessary. I would suspect you'd also see Canada stepping up and saying, okay, we'd now like to offer aid to Cuba, the Cuban people, now that they've had to deal with that.
Finally, Rob, looking forward from here, we're obviously still in the early days since these events have taken place. What are you watching for in the coming days, both in terms of domestically in Canada, what we continue to see out of the Prime Minister's office, and what are you watching for globally, particularly in Iran, that could occur that may have an impact on how Canada chooses or needs to navigate this going forward?
The first thing I'm watching is the nature of how the battle is being waged in Iran. Again, we're getting a very close up examination of how a lot of the missile and the pseudo missiles, and when I say pseudo, I'm talking about the drones and things that aren't the big ballistic missiles that, of course, everybody has been focused on, but how this aerospace threat that, of course, the Ukrainians have had to deal with. Well, how is this playing out now in Iran? Because it gives us different types of insights. I'm paying attention to, and so difficult to get good information, but how well are the defensive means actually working? Because again, we take that back to Canada, and both the Canadian Arctic foreign policy and the update for Canadian defense policy recognize the modern missile as the new threat to Canada. Now they're talking about hypersonics, they're talking about a high level types of threats that would be coming from Russia if you really read in detail of what those two documents are saying. And so the question is, what are we doing in terms of preparing our defenses against it? What is the role in terms of the fighter aircraft? In other words, we're seeing pictures, we're seeing individual little pieces like the three F-15s that are being shot down. There's a picture of the one going down. That doesn't give a very good picture. It sort of goes back to sort of like a World War II imagery of a P-51 being shot down. That doesn't tell us anything in terms of how those aircraft are integrated with the other missile defensive systems and the delivery systems of coming around the Iranian defenses. In other words, what's playing out right now is a small taste of what we are trying to build our defensive capabilities about and how we integrate. And so really what I'm watching for is, as much as one has to be very suspicious about any information, but how is that war actually being fought? How do we think of this system of system aerospace battle that is now being brought forward? And what does that mean for Canadian defense? I think from a Canadian perspective, it's going to be interesting to watch how the Canadian public responds to Carney's statements about this maybe being regrettable. That's one part of it. But the other part, yeah, the Americans were right to take care of a threat. So, because again, the narrative within Canada hasn't really fixated on Iran as a threat. We have this ongoing discussion about how we understand Russia and and China as a threat. And with the second term of the Trump administration and his threats to annex Canada, that has entered into the narrative in terms of how we understand it. But I think that we're going to be seeing an interesting set of discussions about how we then come to terms within Canadian society, how we think about Iran. Do we totally disregard, as some people suggest, that the fact that there were significant proportions of Canadian society that took to the streets to protest against the Iranian actions? Do we then sort of say, Hogue really wasn't focusing on Iran, therefore it's not really a major problem? Or do we bear down on that and say, yeah, they're one of the top five? Of course, most people will now say, well, we got to expand that list to six, because it's pretty unlikely that the Americans aren't doing things to influence. And I mean, even in my home province in Alberta, you start to see that discussion. Are there efforts, for example, the Americans supporting the independence movement within Canada? So, realistically, we have to recognize that too. But it's going to be the question how we understand the Iranian threat. And I think domestically, do we ignore it? Do we just turn around and say, you know what? We'd rather focus on United States, China, and Russia and have those discussions, and Iran is just a blip? Or do we bear down and say, look, this was something they made the top five for political interference? They're doing stuff. We have to be aware. And so I think domestically, that's what I'm going to be watching. How the war is being fought, what it says in terms of the modern day battlefield, and what it means domestically for our ability to understand what obviously, again, going back to the government and the Hogue report, is a political, well, right now it's a political enemy of Canada. Anybody trying to politically interfere is an enemy of the state.
And what are you watching for on the Canada-US file to see if Washington has taken note of the Canadian position on Iran? And do you think, is that something we see play out in the short term, or do we have to wait a bit? Does it perhaps factor into things like the coming CUSMA trade negotiations?
Yeah, isn't that the question? I mean, the biggest problem we have is separating how much Trump is bluster, how much Trump is actually meaning what he says, and how much that poses a threat challenge problem for Canada. And so I think that a lot of people are seeing, given the fact that we're showing support, does that take us out of the limelight? Right now, to be out of the attention of the Americans is a good thing. I mean, a year ago, it was always good to be in the American attention, showing that, hey, you're at the front of the parade. I think now we've come to realize that, no, you want to be able to do your own thing. You want to let the adults in the room, as the saying always goes, come together to be able to negotiate such things as getting rid of those idiotic tariffs. We know that they're hurting everybody. And so on that particular context, we've got to be watching, do we fall into the reemerge in the American rhetoric as countries not doing things right for America, or do we suddenly disappear from that discussion? I mean, it's a terrible thing to think that the best hope that we have is not to be noticed by the Americans, and that's really what I'm saying in this particular context. And what happens in the actual hardcore negotiations? In other words, we know that the free trade talks are coming forward. We know that there's going to be discussions about the tariffs. What actually happens with that? And I think looking for a cause and effect will be a very Canadian thing, though I'm fearful that the Americans don't have that cause and effect. That even if, in fact, we do everything right, and then Trump just gets in a bad mood against Canada for whatever reasons, we still end up suffering. And of course, then then you kind of throw your hands up and you say, well, what are we supposed to do? And I don't have an answer for that.
Right on. Well, we will continue to follow all of these threads here at the Institute. Rob, we really appreciate you joining us here today. Rob Huebert is the director of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. And to our viewers, if you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching Inside Policy Talks.